That is true. How's everybody doing?
Real good.
Yeah, I don't have to call you today. I always wondered if it interfered with the mic. So I tried to keep the phone away from the mic. But may not have. All right, we are in Acts chapter 22 this morning. Hopefully finish up this chapter, and we'll start on chapter 23 next time. But 22, and so chapter 22 is our introduction to Paul's first defense of himself to the Jews. So if you remember, chapter 21 finished with Paul being arrested. Paul was he was on his way to the temple, and they seized him and drug him out of the court, and they had all these accusations against him that he was teaching against the law, that he was teaching against the Jewish life, the culture, and that he had brought a Gentile into the temple, which was not true. But this was a mob, and the mob didn't care. As we talked about on Wednesday, and we're looking at Esther, with Esther, Mordecai, once things were figured out, or once the proclamation was sent out for the Jews to be killed, Mordecai didn't respond by a mob mentality. He went and tried to figure out the facts, to know what was going on, what happened before he reacted. And his reaction, of course, was not a mob mentality, but it's different than what we see here, because once you get a few people upset, all of the people that wanted to be upset just got upset with them, and then nobody knew what was going on. Once the commander came, he had no clue what happened, and the people didn't know. And so, end of 21, Paul has stood up, and he is going to speak this message to them, and that is really the first part of chapter 22. And so, where did we get to? We got down to verse 11, didn't we? No, we got down to verse 16, didn't we? Yes, we did. All right, so Paul has given his defense, verse 6, really through verse 11. We're getting a little bit more information about the accounts of Acts chapter 9. Verse 12 talks about Ananias had come to him. Verse 15, we talked about the fact that he saw Jesus, he saw Christ, he spoke to him. Defense of those verses were 1 Corinthians 9 and verse 1, 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 8. Paul himself stated there that he saw Christ. And so that tells us that he can be a witness. Now, what do people say as a witness? They say, well, they're a witness to God today or to Christ. Huh? They can't be, right? They say that, but in Scripture, what is a witness? What is the witness of? Christ and his resurrection, that he was alive, right?
Witness is a verb.
Yeah, they use, that's a good way to say it. They use witness as a verb. Because the witness that we see here is that Christ is alive. They saw him. And, you think about what Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15. All the people that saw Jesus alive. And then Paul says he was the last to see him. That is a reference to what we're talking about here. And so Ananias tells him he's going to be that witness to all men of what you have seen and heard, of seeing Christ and seeing him alive. Then verse 16, it says, now why are you waiting? Arise and be baptized, wash away your sins, calling on the name of the Lord. And so we ended up talking about that question. In a sense, Paul is asking that same question that was asked in Acts chapter 2 in verse 37. They asked the question, what must we do? Here, Paul is asking the same thing. What do I do? And Ananias gives him that answer. That answer was to be baptized. Now, what's important about this is that Paul was, for 3 days, fasting. He was for 3 days, distraught, praying. Does that show a heart that is saved? Does that show a heart that...
Shows a heart that's repentant,
Yes.
not saved.
It shows a heart that is repentant, that knows what they have done, and knows what they need to do, or doesn't know what he needs to do, but knows what they've done. And until Ananias came to him and said, this is what you need to do to get rid of that sin, the sin in your life, as you go back to Acts chapter 9, once Paul was baptized, he got up, he ate, he wasn't distraught anymore, he was focused on his responsibility and took his job seriously and started to teach. And so it's important because of what we see that baptism is essential. And we looked at several verses, and really the most important one, the most pointed one is 1 Peter 3 and verse 21. The like figure whereunto baptism doth now also save us. And so baptism is essential, Romans chapter 6. And so after Paul had obeyed that gospel, he got up, his conscience was cleansed. We can see that by his actions. He knew his sins were gone. So the last part of that verse, we didn't talk about this, kind of skipped over it. It says, how does one call in the name of the Lord? By obedience to the gospel. Now, some want to say that calling on the name of the Lord is what? The denominational world says that, a good part of them, say that calling on the name of the Lord is asking Jesus into your heart. That's not at all what Scripture tells us. We see that phrase used in other places, but each time it is pointed to that act of obedience. We see that here. Paul is told to be baptized, calling on the name of the Lord. That means he is to obey the gospel. And so that's it's amazing as you go through the book of Acts how much denominational doctrine is refuted. You can see that here. And again here, the action of Paul obeying the gospel was coupled with his calling on the name of the Lord. So we know what that means. And it's other places too. All right, so then that brings us to verse 17. Verse 17 through 21. It says, now it happened when I returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple that I was in a trance, and saw him saying to me, make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, for they will not receive your testimony concerning me. Now this is interesting because this is a record of Jesus talking to Paul we have not seen before. It's the first time we've seen that. Now, when was this that this happened? Well, it's going to be his first missionary journey. This is going to be back in Acts chapter 9. So somebody read Acts chapter 9, verse 28 and 29. All right, so they were seeking to kill him. Paul leaves Jerusalem, and that is going to be very soon, it's going to happen very soon that Paul starts his first missionary journey. But this account of what we're being told here is of what we see in Acts chapter 9, verse 28 and 29. And so Paul gives us more information. It's saying when he was in the temple, he was in a trance. It says, make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, for they will not receive your testimony concerning me. Now, this is just an account of what happened, but Paul is defending himself, right? He's defending the things that he has done. He is defending the fact that, as we first talked about, his faith, his hope. He's giving a perfect defense of his hope. This is where I was at. This is what I was doing. I figured out I was wrong, and I had a zeal towards God now that should be. So he's telling people that wanted to kill him, which are Jews, that Jesus spoke to me when I was in Jerusalem the first time after I became a Christian. And he told me to leave. Why? who's going to get killed, yeah, they will not receive your testimony. He is telling them, Jesus knew that you would not receive this, okay? He's building up to what he's going to say here in a minute. And so, is that going to upset them? Yes. But that's not what really upsets them. They are upset about it, but we're going to see that what really upset is the fact that he was told to go to the Gentiles. And so, Paul, do you think Paul felt guilty for the things that he'd done in his past?
Sure did.
As we talked about a little bit, and I think it's even brought up here, notice verse 19. It says, "So I said, Lord, they know that in every synagogue I imprison and beat those who believe in you. And when the blood of your martyr Stephen was shed, I was also standing by consenting to his death and guarding the clothes of those who were killing him." Paul feels guilty for what he has done. He didn't feel like he should be the one that goes out and does what he's been commissioned to do because of what he had done. He had killed Christians. Here he tells us this. And we talked about that already in the fact that, going back to, what verse was that? Verse 4, it says, "I persecuted this way to death." The way is Christ, his church, is the gospel. And it says to death, knowing that he was killing Christians, the things that he was doing. Not only that, in verse 20, he was consenting to whose death? Stephen's. The word consenting means to be pleased at the same time, to agree to. Even though Paul was not throwing the stones, he was still agreeing that Stephen should be killed.
2 John 9 through 11.
Mm-hmm.
You're consenting to it, you're guilty of it.
Exactly.
But Paul later on said, and I can't tell you the verse, but he said, forgetting the past and pressing on towards the goal.
Mm-hmm.
He's saying, and I can think of that verse where it's at, but what he's saying is, I'm not dwelling in my mind about what happened in the past.
Mm-hmm.
But it's there as a reminder not to do it again.
Yep, exactly. Did it still bother him? Yes. And here he's definitely bothered by it. But there's two things I think we see here. He's bothered by it, but the other reason he brings it up is why. He understands what they're thinking. He's been there. He's telling them, I was just like you. They're wanting to kill Paul. They're wanting to stop the gospel from being spread. Paul's saying, I was there. I did the exact same thing you're doing. I understand. And I was wrong. That's what he's telling them. I was wrong. And so he understands. He knows what they're going through. It's just like anybody else that goes through something in their life. They can go to somebody that's having the same problem and say, I know what you're going through. Someone that has come out of a certain sin can help someone else to get out of that sin because they understand what they're thinking. They understand what they've gone through. Paul is saying, I understand your zeal right now. I understand your frustration. I understand your anger, but it's misguided. Your zeal is misguided. You need to see the truth, and he's trying to show them that. And so then that brings us to verse 21. Then he said to me, depart, for I will send you far from here to the Gentiles. And so this, he was told by Ananias in Acts chapter 9, verse 15 and 16, that his commission was to go to who? To the Gentiles, right? He would be that one that would bring it to the Gentiles. Ananias told him that. Here, Jesus tells him that. Depart, for I will send you far from the Gentiles. Then that brings us to verse 22. It says, and they listened to him until this word. What word? Gentile. That, if you want to anger the Jews at that time, talk about the Gentiles having hope. Talk about the Gentiles being able to have the same reward as them. And that would upset them. So what does it say? And then they raised their voices and said, away with such a fellow from this earth, for he is not fit to live. Not only were they just angry, they wanted him dead. They were fine with Paul until he brought up the Gentiles. This just brought them back to their problem with Paul in the first place, his involvement with Gentiles. They didn't like that. They raised their voices. They didn't want to hear what he had to say anymore. I think that's interesting. They raised their voices. What's the purpose of raising your voice? To drown you out. What did they do with Stephen when he was standing in front of the Sanhedrin?
They gnashed on him with their teeth.
Yeah, they started yelling at him and gnashing at them out of their teeth. The same thing. They were trying to stop him. They were trying to drown him out. And here with Paul, the same thing. And so then as they cried out and tore off their clothes and threw dust in the air, the commander ordered him to be brought into the barracks and said that he should be examined under scourging so he might know why they shouted so against him. And so their anger was so great that they started to throw off their clothes. Now, there's two ways to look at this. So they throw off their clothes and they start throwing dust in the air. What does that sound like? It makes you go. It makes me laugh too because they're showing their immaturity, right? Really. Yeah, they're throwing a tantrum. That's kind of what I looked at. Here they are, they're throwing their clothes off, they're throwing dust up in the air, they're yelling, they're stomping their feet probably, just acting out like no other. But what is another reason they could have been taking off their clothes? It's not all their clothes. They're talking about their outer garment. Well, it could be to keep it clean, but it'll
Freeze them to handle him better.
Yes, freeze them to be able to handle him and throw stones. I think what they're trying to do here is they're getting ready to stone him, which is pretty bold because where is he at? Yeah, the soldiers. He's up on the stairs of the castle that's not far from the temple. Is in their protection, and they're angry. They're so angry they want to kill him. So they're possibly they're getting ready to throw stones at him. They're throwing the dust up in the air because their rage was terrible. Somebody read 2 Samuel 16 verse 13. Just another place we've seen this kind of before. 2 Samuel 16 and verse 13. Mm-hmm. Yep.
So David and his men went on the road while Shimei went along on the hillside opposite him and cursed as he went and threw stones at him and flung dust.
All right. So there, we have David seeing the same thing happen. Someone's in similar rage against him, throwing a fit, temper tantrum, whatever the case may be, is throwing dust up in the air and throwing stones and cursing at him. Which he's going to regret later doing, but we see that happen here. And so you can imagine, what is going through the mind of the commander at this time. He's now witnessing two mobs getting out of control. The first one is when he goes to seize Paul. They had been beating Paul to the point where Paul was not even able to walk up the stairs anymore. They had to carry him up the stairs. Now they have him here in front of the castle. The mob is getting out of control again. And so he's probably, and Paul is the center of both of those. And so he's determined to get to the bottom of this. And so his answer was to bring Paul into the barracks that he should be examined under scourging. Where have we seen scourging happen before?
And scourging, does that mean whipping?
Yes. So scourge was a whip, and so this whip would sometimes have sheep's bone and other pieces of metal kind of woven into the whips. And in the case of Jesus, it was used to rip their skin open and cause extreme pain. And so what this was going to do was be a time where he would be able to make Paul get to the point that he would confess what he's really doing. And so it's going to tear Paul up. It's going to be pretty severe. And so that's what his purpose is. Somebody say something? Nope. All right, verse 24 and says, so that they might know why they shouted against him. He still doesn't understand what's going on. Verse 25, and as they bound him with thongs, Paul said to the centurion who stood by, it is lawful for you to scourge a man who is a Roman and uncondemned. Now, this should have been something he already knew, right? We talked about this in chapter 21. When he came to Paul, he thought he was the man that had went out into the wilderness and caused an uprising that Rome had to go out and deal with. And Paul says, no, I'm a humble man from Tarsus, a Jew. He probably should have known that. But here, he uses this opportunity to defend himself, to protect himself. This could have been pretty bad for Paul, painful. And Paul uses his citizenship to get out of it, to protect himself. Was that wrong in doing that? No. If we're in a similar situation, hopefully we never are, but if we're in another country, someone might say, well, hey, I'm a U.S. citizen, and be able to use that to protect themselves from, go to the what's the place? The consulate or whatever to get protected. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with what he did here. And so they were tying him with ropes. They were going to beat him. He says this. Lipscomb says this, it's not lawful thus to bind and punish a Roman citizen, but the law permitted slaves and aliens and subject races to be so treated. So this treatment that he was getting was something that was done to criminals, to slaves, to aliens, and it could not be done to a Roman citizen. Now, did Paul do this before? So somebody read Acts chapter 16, verse 36 through 37.
So the keepers of the prison reported these words to Paul, saying, the magistrates have said to let you go. Now therefore depart and go in peace. But Paul said to them, they have beaten us openly, uncondemned Romans, and have thrown us into prison. And now do they put us out secretly? No, indeed, let them come themselves and let us out.
Yeah, there is funny because Paul uses that. He is beaten there. And then when they come to get him, he says, you beat an uncondemned Roman. Now, have those magistrates come and get us out. It's just kind of funny. He uses that. He's saying, not you, but you have the magistrates that did this come get us. Which then, of course, they were scared of what they had done. The commander here is scared too, because if he had beaten him, it would have been bad. Barnes says this, I think it's interesting. It says, the freedom or privilege of Roman citizenship. From this, it would seem that a privilege of being a Roman citizen might be purchased, unless perhaps he refers to the expenses which were necessarily attended in passing through the proper forms of becoming a Roman citizen. The argument of the tribune in this case is this: I obtained this privilege at a great price. Whence did you, Paul, thus poor and persecuted, obtain the means of becoming a Roman citizen? This is his answer to Paul when he says that he is a Roman. Verse 26 says, when the centurion heard that, he went and told the commander, saying, take care of what you do, for this man is a Roman. Then the commander came and said to him, tell me, are you a Roman? He said, yes. The commander said, with a large sum I attained this citizenship. And Paul said, but I was born a citizen. And so there was a difference there. And in a sense, he is saying, did you, this poor and persecuted person, how did you pay your way to be a citizen of Rome? Paul says, I didn't. I was born it. And so it's just interesting to think about. His thought was that Paul paid for his citizenship, and yet he wasn't. He was born a citizen. In verse 26, it says, then immediately those who were about to examine him withdrew from him, and the commander was also afraid after he found out that he was a Roman, and because he had bound him. And so very similar to what we saw in Acts 16, they were scared. because if they could have been punished for doing something to this uncondemned Roman.
It was against the law to even bind him.
Yep, exactly. It's a pretty serious charge of what they did. And then he's probably also thinking through his mind, here we had this Roman citizen that was beat by these Jews out here to the point of almost death, and we allowed that to happen. And so, he's probably got a lot going through his mind. I'm in trouble. I could be in trouble here, and what's happened. All right, so verse 30, it says, the next day, because he wanted to know for certain why he was accused by the Jews, he released him from his bonds and commanded the chief priests and all their council to appear and brought Paul down and set him before them. And so that ends chapter 22. In chapter 23, we're going to get into this discussion of Paul in front of the council. Is there any questions or comments on chapter 22?
I've got a question on it.
Yeah.
It seems that possibly that Paul had more privilege being a born citizen than the one that was born a citizen.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I think that's the case. Because of where he was also born because he was born in Tarsus of Sicilia, that he had different privileges. I think they were treated differently, as in better, as being born instead of just purchasing it.
Was that an area that got conquered
By Rome? Yeah.
Yeah, versus if you were actually in Rome?
Yes. So this was taken over by Rome. So Rome then took this over from the Seleucids. So it'd be some of the Greek Empire. So I can't remember who was the northern kingdom.
So if you were born in like Rome, you'd have probably more rights, maybe?
Well, since they annexed that area into Roman control, I'm guessing they considered it to be Rome, since he was born a citizen. Instead of his being.
I think his father a Roman or something.
Don't remember.
I don't either for sure, but it seemed like.
Don't remember. I think I could find out, but I don't remember. It might be. It might be. His mother was a Jew.
Probably had to be. For him to be born a Roman, he had to be a Roman.
Yeah.
Had to be a Roman citizen.
Probably right. So yeah, Paul is going to be able to use that to keep himself protected from this point forward. Also, he's going to be treated differently, but then also because of his character, he's going to be treated differently. He was respected by even those that were there to keep him bound as he went to Caesar, and so he was respected, and it's because of his character. All right, anything else? That's all I had for 22. Really didn't know we'd get this far. We could go in and read the first part of 23 and start there. Somebody want to read verse 1 through 10. We'll do a little bit here before we end class. We still got a few minutes. 23, 1 through 10, please.
Where's verse is that again? I'm trying to find it.
Right here.
Well, I can't.
Where's your glasses?
That's way east of where I'm at. Okay.
You said 150.
Yep.
And looking intently at the council, Paul said, brothers, I have lived my life before God in all good conscience up to this day. And the high priest, Ananias, commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Are you sitting to judge me according to the law, and yet contrary to the law you order me to be struck? Those who stood by said, would you revile God's high priest? And Paul said, I did not know, brothers, that he was the high priest, for it is written,
All right, so at the end of 22, as we talked about, as we start this discussion, Paul was released from the bonds of this commander. So Paul is now free to go. But it's interesting is that this commander, which is over this area of Jerusalem, he commands the chief priests and the councils to appear. He's like, okay, now it's time to deal with this. I want all of those that are involved, I want them to meet with Paul, and I want to discuss this and figure out what's going on. Because he doesn't understand. You think about it, he was going to beat Paul to try to figure out why the crowd was so angry. He doesn't understand what's causing this. He just sees Paul speaking, and then they start screaming and yelling at him. He doesn't understand the fact that he's talking about the Gentiles receiving the gospel. And so then, first part of 23, it says, then Paul, looking earnestly at the council, said, men and brethren, I have lived in all good conscience before God unto this day. What does that include?
That includes killing Christians.
It does. Paul said that everything that he had done to this point, that he did it with the mindset that he was doing the right thing. And that makes me think of Philippians chapter 3. Here when Paul is defending himself, let's turn over there. Philippians chapter 3. And somebody will read verse 3 through 8. Or actually 3 through 7.
For we are the circumcision who worship by the Spirit of God and glory in Christ Jesus and put no confidence in the flesh. Though I myself have reason for confidence in the flesh also. If anyone else thinks he has reason for confidence in the flesh, I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, as to the law, a Pharisee, as to zeal, a persecutor of the church, as to righteousness under the law, blameless. But whatever gain I had, I counted as loss for the sake of Christ.
All right, so Paul talks about his previous life, and he's saying, I had done everything. He said, you can see that in his character, in the fact that when he did something, he tried to do his best at it. He tried to be the best at it. And he was. He went and learned under the feet of Gamaliel. He became a Hebrew of Hebrew. He became a Pharisee. He kept strict to the law to the point where he was zealous for everyone that should be following the law in his mind to follow it, to the point of persecuting the church. And so he had a zeal, he says here. He says, talking about zeal. Now that word zeal, if you look it up, it means fire. It means heat. It means, so it can be used in a bad way, which of course Paul's talking about it here. He said, I had a fire, a heat, and anger for killing Christians. But he can also talk about zeal and being a good thing for God. But he thought he was doing the right thing. He thought he was following as he should. And he killed Christians. And so then when we go back to Acts chapter 23, Paul is telling them, I have done all of this in good conscience until in front of God. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I wasn't.
He said in one place, about the Jews, they had a zeal for God, but it was without knowledge.
Without knowledge, exactly. There's many people today that have zeal for God. There's many great people throughout our world and our communities that have a great zeal for God, but without knowledge,
Well,
without the right focus.
they believe in God, but they don't believe
God. Believe God, yeah. We talked about that a couple weeks ago, the fact that there's a difference. Believing in God is believing who he is. Believing God is trusting him, his promises, and obeying him. That's right. So, Paul had that zeal, and he's showing to them, he's saying, I had this zeal, I'd done what I thought was right, but I was wrong. You need to see that too. And he's hoping they'll see that. All right, any questions or comments? We're going to stop here. We'll pick up here next time. All right, thank you guys for your comments.